Evan, your opponents are arguing that what you said you experienced can be explained by what we already know about the brain. That, as they put it, you had a real experience about something that was not real.
I think the important thing to point out is I get asked to give a lot of talks at medical groups, neurosurgical and other surgical groups, physician groups, because they realize the power of the medical situation. And I think this is what certainly grabbed me and challenged me within weeks after my coma as my knowing of brain-mind consciousness came back, and I started to review the records to reveal just how sick I was. I think the problem is that any other reason for being in deep coma, I probably would have been stuck, because usually if there's some part of the neocortex that's still working, you could make an argument that that part was part of the process of putting it all together. But I think the important thing to point out is with my neocortex so badly damaged, it became very difficult to try and come up with a way to explain how this very rich, elaborate set of memories occurred.
So in answer to my question, you're arguing there really can be no other possible explanation, that you had a real experience about something that can only be real.
Well, it was a very real experience that had no way of occurring in my physical brain. Now, initially I looked at all kinds of possibilities. Could it have happened early, going in? Could it have happened coming out? Was there some way that other structures in the brain or some part of the brain was participating in generating this very long, elaborate journey? And yet, that's where I kept running into trouble with it.
Okay, let's bring it over to Sean Carroll then, where your opponent Eben Alexander is saying that what he experienced can only be explained as a real experience. Sean Carroll, why don't you respond to that?
Well, I think that Stephen can talk about the specifics that might have been going on in the brain, but my emphasis is on we're weighing two different comprehensive pictures here. We have personal testimony from someone who says he experienced something and it's very real, and says that, well, we can't imagine, even as a neurosurgeon, he just doesn't know what could possibly have been going on in his brain that would make that happen. Therefore, let's throw out all of the laws of physics. And I think that that is not nearly enough standard of evidence.
Stop right there. Eben, is that true?
No, that's not at all true. In fact, they still teach quantum mechanics, right?
They do.
Good, because I think
now.
It's important to point out, from my point of view, what drove the founding fathers of that field into mysticism was the fact that getting at the very depths of trying to understand subatomic reality, they were led to believe that consciousness, the observing mind, actually played a role in the unfolding of what was being observed. And I think that that mystery, to my satisfaction, has not really been solved in a way that says that the concerns of people like de Broglie and Dirac, Einstein, Bohr, and others, that they were trying to understand how consciousness influenced
So
things.
is your point that there is a kind of reality that you are saying is beyond science, the tools of science that we know now?
Well, I believe at some point science can be very useful at determining a lot of this.
But what Sean was saying to you was that you're basically saying there just cannot be any other explanation other than the one that I have, and therefore science really isn't relevant at this point.
I think that, that, in my view, this is all about how understanding the true nature of consciousness, soul and spirit, has a lot to do with helping to take physics to the next level in terms of understanding the nature of quantum mechanics.
The thing about Einstein, Bohr, de Broglie, etc., the founders of quantum mechanics, is that they're all dead, and they've been dead for many decades. And we know what's going on much better now than we did back then. They were inventing quantum mechanics, and occasionally they toyed with the idea that somehow consciousness had something to do with the fundamental laws of quantum mechanics. Now we know better. We know how the laws of quantum mechanics help explain how electrons move in the brain, and there's nothing in there.
Take 15 seconds and tell us why quantum mechanics has been brought up by your opponent, why that has relevance here.
Well, I can only quote MIT physicist Scott Aronson, who says, as far as he can tell, quantum mechanics is confusing and consciousness is confusing, so maybe they're the same.
I think
you know, Dr. Alexander said that the experience that he remembers, again, I don't doubt he has a memory of a profound experience, that he could not have occurred as he was coming out of his coma, but you have no basis for that statement, I don't think. That you have no sense of time. Your brain also constructs your sense of time. And when your brain is only partially working, you can have experiences that are hyper-real, that are bizarre, that, you know, it's hard for you to reconstruct. And then your memory struggles to sort of construct a narrative that makes sense. It takes these bits and pieces of things that were firing in your head when you were in this semi-conscious state, and it constructs a narrative out of it, based usually culturally on your pre-existing beliefs.
You're providing a lot of other ways that what Eben says could not have happened.
Okay, so consistent with what
I want to take that back to Eben. Then, so your opponent, Stephen Novella, has just laid out many scenarios in which what you experienced could have been real to you, but not real.
Well, I would say.
And what are your responses to his specifics? That's what I want you to do: is to respond to Stephen Novella's, you know, 2 or 3 scenarios for ways in which what you experienced may have been generated by your ill brain.
Well, to have that be an explanation, one would want at least some part of the neocortex still in a state that could participate, because all of our modern thinking in neuroscience...
During your recovery.
Wait, let him finish. Go ahead.
...is that there really was no part of my brain. I mean, the factors that showed me when it happened, which was between days 1 and 5 and not at the end on coming out of it, basically, those are part of the experience itself that, to me, were very difficult to explain, because they showed that it happened when my doctors told me my brain was way too sick to manufacture anything.
Okay, so that's a very solid answer. He's saying his brain was flat. Nothing was going on. Therefore, the kinds of experiences you are saying his brain could have generated, they could not have generated. It was shut.
We don't know, and he didn't give an answer to the question of when did those memories form. We don't know. They were not necessarily happening when you were at your worst, and when you were at your worst, there wasn't the kind of functional monitoring that we would have needed to know that your brain was not functioning at all. We don't know that. We saw anatomically it had edema, swelling, and that certainly would have, you know, kept you unconscious. But you weren't getting an fMRI, a PET scan, or an EEG, as far as I could see in anything that you've written or said about it, that would have documented zero brain activity. You can't say that. Nobody can say that. And even still, the memories that you have now were not necessarily formed when you were at your deepest part of the coma. They could have been forming in the hours and days when you were coming out of the coma. Then you had a later delusional period, but at different points in time, different parts of your brain were working or not working, and you were constructing reality in a very bizarre way, in ways that we can reproduce with drugs and hypotension and, you know, with electromagnetic stimulation of different parts of your brain.
Is that valid, that the entire near-death experience, as described by thousands of people, can be recreated by drugs and putting electricity across the brain?
No, I would say that's not true at all. There are tremendous examples of people encountering souls of departed loved ones, learning information that they couldn't possibly learn in any other way. You had said earlier that there were no cases of any of these memories being generated you know, when the brain was out, and yet there are examples of that, where the brain, people under deep anesthesia with complete circulatory arrest, things like that, where they do have some astonishing stories of getting information that it doesn't seem to be any other way that they could have gotten it. So those cases are out there.
But those cases are not, you know, controlled or documented. So in other words, that we don't know that they couldn't have gotten that information any other way. A lot of those cases I've read, you're getting information that is either plausible or later was retrofitted to the scenario. It's all a lot of special pleading, the same kind of information you get from a psychic. It's not controlled scientific information. There are, in fact, attempts at putting controls in place, like putting playing cards on top of a shelf that could only be viewed if you were actually floating above the ceiling. And to the extent that those have been done, no one has been able to demonstrate any information that could only have been obtained while they were extracorporeal, floating above their body. And by the way, we could make you float above your body.
So I actually want to move on to a different point that was made, and that was, Sean Carroll, you were making the point that we're wired to want this to be true. We're wired to want to shape strange events into narratives, and into narratives that we particularly like. And my response to that is, maybe that's true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's what happened over here. And there's a little bit of an argumentum ad hominem thing about it, is you're not a reliable reporter because you just want that to be true. And I like to, it's a little bit insulting almost to say you can't be trusted because you want everything to be happy. To respond to that.
I hope it's not insulting. It's certainly not ad hominem, because the message is that nobody can be trusted. I think that that is part of what science has taught us, that if someone makes an extraordinary claim, the very first questions we should be asking ourselves are, number one, is there a different, simpler, alternative explanation? And number two, how would we know if our purported explanation were false? How would we disprove it? How could we possibly test this idea? And I think that, when you look at the bigger picture of how the universe works, how the laws of physics work, the enormous success of understanding matter, energy, the brain, life, everything that we've had, there's just an enormous presumption against the idea that somehow, through ways that there are no equations, no experiments, or no direct evidence to tell us, the information in our brains persists after we die and is there forever in talking to other people who died. So it's just a matter of presumption. There's plenty of things that I would like to be true, and I have been tricked into believing they're true, so I know that I should be especially skeptical about them.
All right, Raymond Moody, you're the philosopher on the panel, and you've said that this is essentially a philosophical question. Mm-hmm. So take on what Sean Carroll has just said from the philosophical point of view.
What I would say about what Sean says is I agree with it up to a point, in the sense that, yes, I love physics too, and I accept there's a physical realm and so on. But that doesn't rule out that there could be a state of being that doesn't operate by physical principles. I noticed, Sean, when you were trying to think of some other realm, you were thinking in terms of energy or soul substance or whatever, but I'm talking about something entirely different. It's, there's no inconceivability in thinking that everything that we know is true, and yet there is a higher dimension or a higher domain of existence that sort of, in which this one is included.
But listen, I mean, I think that's a perfect thing to have said in this debate, because it illustrates the difference here. No evidence was given for this claim. No reason to believe it was given. All we are given is, well, maybe it's true and you can't absolutely disprove it. Maybe it is conceivable. We have laws of physics that tell us how the moon moves around the earth, and they work very well. It is conceivable that there are also angels living inside the moon guiding it around in exactly the way that Newton's laws tell us. But we don't take that seriously as an idea because there's no need for it or evidence for it. So the question is not, is it conceivable that there are other realms? The question is the evidence in favor of that other realm so overwhelming that it causes us to dismiss the enormous successes of physics, chemistry, biology, and neuroscience?
No, I would say absolutely not. It doesn't require you to dismiss the findings of science to...
Come over here to this side. We'll welcome you. We'll put your chair over here.
And yet, I think it's entirely conceivable that there's some other domain of existence over this, that some people gain access to it sometimes, and I know hundreds and hundreds of them.
And how would we know if there weren't?
You know something? You're right about the falsifiability problem, Sean. That's very big in the afterlife question. But I think the way that this is going to work out is that what we need to do is to prepare people in advance before they ever have a near-death experience in new ways of thinking about these things. You know, the standard objection to mystical experience has always been, as A.J. Ayer put it, that if the mystic tells us that he can't possibly describe what he experienced, then he's got to admit that he's talking unintelligibly when he talks about it. And that's the problem that we can change, because I think But
I feel to some degree that's the argument you're presenting is, no, we can't prove it, but that doesn't mean it's not real.
My argument is that when thousands and thousands of people whose judgment I trust in all other circumstances, medical friends.
Give us
of
one
mine.
example, because I know you've written about this. Examples where people who were not the person lying in the bed, but other people in the room had an experience, and let the other side respond to that.
Okay.
And just lean into that, Mike. Thanks.
An artist I met a couple of years ago, Jeff Olson by name, a very well-known graphic artist, had a horrific car crash in which he lost his leg. His wife was killed instantly, and he had a profound near-death experience. As he was thinking about this, and what am I going to do about this? His doctor had not been informed about this. So he decided to write this story up, and then he wanted to use the name of his doctor. So he called the doctor and invited him to lunch. The doctor came, and Jeff told him the story of his near-death experience, whereupon the surgeon said, well, I've never told anybody this, but that night you were in the hospital, I knew that you weren't going to die. Your wife was talking with me in the surgery room, and
his dead wife.
Yes, and so did the scrub nurse. Also had an experience of vivid sense of presence and seeing the. So my point here is that it's not proof, but at a certain point, where do you draw the line and give people respect?
So you've put an example out there where it's not simply about the brain activity of the person lying in the bed, but that the notion of an afterlife represented by this apparition. We are talking about ghosts now, and I'm sorry that sounded pejorative, but we are talking about something that a lot of people would challenge as incredibly implausible, but you're taking the argument seriously, so I want your opponents to respond to it seriously.
Well, we want to know what's really, really true, not just what seems to be true, what we want to be true. And, again, our brains are narrative-generating machines. It tries to construct a story that makes sense to us, appeals to us, puts everything together seamlessly, and we can have what we believe, we have memories of experiences that mean something to us but don't really relate to reality. We know this is true. If you accept that level of evidence, and this is not about respect, I believe that people have these memories of these experiences. That's just about the interpretation of it.
Are you talking about the scrub nurse and the doctors?
Anyone. I mean, think about it.
But these scrub nurse and doctors were met this woman at separate places, right? On the same night.
But all we have is a story constructed after the fact. Okay. We have similar stories about people being abducted by UFOs, seeing Bigfoot, any weird kind of experience you could imagine. If you accept this level of evidence, then you have to believe every paranormal claim out there, because we have that level of evidence for thousands of stories that are conflicting, mutually exclusive, often culturally dependent. It's simply not acceptable. And we know for a fact that the brain can absolutely manufacture those memories, come to absolutely believe a story like that. That's absolutely not true.
I just want to ask very, very quickly for Eben Alexander, do we know that the brain can manufacture those experiences?
I would say the brain does not create consciousness. That is something a lot of scientists, those interested in neuroscience, are far along that pathway now. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. In fact, no neuroscientist on Earth can give the first sentence to explain the mechanism by which the physical brain creates consciousness.
We don't have to know how the brain creates consciousness in order to know that it creates consciousness. That it creates consciousness, we absolutely know. Just like we don't have to know how the Earth generates gravity to know that it generates gravity. There's no question we have gravity, even though we haven't untangled the deepest understanding of every possible thing. So yes, we don't know exactly how the brain creates consciousness, but the evidence can only leads to one interpretation, and that is that it is consciousness. The consciousness is what the brain does. No question.
Alexander.
As I said, no neuroscientist on Earth can give the first sentence to explain a mechanism by which the physical brain gives rise to consciousness.
But not knowing the mechanism...
Is that true?
No, I disagree with that, because there's consciousness research. There are researchers who are doing a very good job of making progress of understanding consciousness as a neurological phenomenon. We certainly are not all the way there of understanding exactly what it is. It's a very difficult thing not to crack. But we are not at the... But not knowing the mechanism is not the same thing as saying it's not possible or it's impossible or we need a non-physical mechanism.
Given that point, but is he accurate that we don't know the mechanism by which the brain gives rise to consciousness?
Well, it's not a black or white thing. We have some knowledge. We don't have complete knowledge about it. It's like saying, do we understand everything about genetics? No, but we know that DNA is the molecule of inheritance. That's not questionable.
Sentence. Give the first sentence of how you would trace from the physical brain that it gives rise to consciousness.
Let's go to some audience questions. Right down front here.
One thing that you would need to know that would make you believe them even a little bit.
For me, I'm open to evidence for anything. What I would need to see is some information that the people having the experience gained through no other mechanism. So then there are experiments ongoing. Preliminary ones have been negative. There are bigger ones ongoing to see if people could, for example, look at on the top shelf and see a card that's placed there that you could only see if you were actually floating above, near the ceiling. So that would be compelling evidence. I mean, it would need to be enough to that would be enough to me to at least take it seriously. But then to say that it's probably true, you need as much evidence as we have for the neuroscientific model, which says it's not possible.
So, Sean Carroll, could you be convinced?
Yeah, I think the idea that we could be convinced of another realm in addition to the natural world is obviously yes. There's a million pieces of evidence that would help convince me. If there's a ghost in the room that could lift up that glass right now, then I would be convinced. For those listening on the radio, the glass is not moving. And it never moves when you do this. And we live in a world that looks exactly like there's only the natural world.
But wouldn't you really kind of like those guys to be right? Sure. Wouldn't it be great?
Yes and no. I think that there's obviously advantages. Yeah. I don't want to die. I want to live after I die, maybe not for infinity years, but for a few 100,000 years. I could amuse myself. Sadly, as a very wise philosopher once said, you can't always get what you want.
Thank you. How can you be so sure about your position when you base it upon what we now know in science? And by the mere fact of what we now know, we're constantly evolving in science. So how can you be so sure about your position when science may learn things that we don't yet know?
Well,
that's a pretty good question.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Stephen Nivella.
As I was saying, I'm a skeptic, so I'm in a perpetual state of doubt about everything. But I need lots of evidence and logic to convince me. And all we could say within the scientific realm is, what does the best evidence tell us today? Right now we have lots of evidence that we could be highly confident in the conclusion that the mind is what the brain does. And we have no compelling evidence, only narratives and really dubious evidence against that proposition, against that notion, or for the notion that there is some consciousness separate from the brain. So the scientific conclusion today is that the mind is the brain. If new dramatic evidence comes to light that changes that, I will happily move along with the evidence.
Sean Carroll, take a crack at the same question.
I think it's a great question because there's this image, like when we're teaching high school in science, that it's a bunch of facts that are absolutely established, whereas professional scientists like to brag about the fact that, like Stephen just did, that we're always skeptical and we're always ready to throw out everything. And both are true, but because there's some intermediate ground. There are many, many things that science does not understand, and we're hoping to get better at it. Many, many things. And there are also some things that science does understand and are not going to go away. This table is made of atoms. We will improve our understanding of what an atom is, what the elementary particles and fields are that make it up, how they interact. That is not finished yet. We can do better. But 1,000,000 years from now, our best scientific understanding will still say that the table is made of atoms. In my judgment, the current status of our scientific understanding, the parts that we're not going to give up, are enough to conclude that death is, in fact, final.
We've been talking a lot tonight about personal experiences and self-created memories of near-death experiences, whether those are real or just crafted by the mind. But I want to know what the against side has to say about admittedly self-proclaimed psychic mediums or people completely removed from the situation that seem to have knowledge of events that they were not present for.
I think that's relevant because your opponents have actually brought up situations like that. So let's go ahead. Thanks for the question. Sean Carroll.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, there is evidence in favor of those kinds of things. There is other evidence against those kinds of things. And the kind of remote seeing or telepathy or telekinesis or clairvoyance that is being talked about here is in utter and complete violation with everything we understand about the current laws of physics. So, you know, if something is seeing something, it has to be able to absorb photons. How does that happen? I think that there's, again, an overwhelming presumption that stuff that is in so flagrant violation with everything we understand about the fundamental way that matter and energy works better have amazingly good evidence in favor of it, and the evidence in favor of psychic phenomena comes nowhere near that standard.
Yeah, even if we put plausibility aside, 100 years of parapsychological research has not been able to produce one bit of compelling, replicable evidence that shows that it's a real phenomenon.
So, Eben Alexander, that sounds like the most powerful salvo against your side yet. So what is your response to that?
My response is that the evidence for things like telepathy, precognition, remote viewing, out-of-body experiences, past life memories in children, the after-death communications is overwhelmingly positive evidence that it exists and is real. For those out there in the scientific community who want to know more, I would urge them to check the book Irreducible Mind Toward a Psychology for the 21st Century, 800 pages of very dense science and data and analysis that shows the absolute reality of non-local consciousness in all of those forms. It shows that we have a long way to go in beginning to understand anything about consciousness, and that the model that brain creates consciousness and that we can only know things locally with our connected senses is completely false and disproven by a lot of scientists, not just in that book and those who participated in that, but in multiple other books. And I mean, for example, the afterlife experiments, Dr. Gary Schwartz, that's a pretty powerful documentation of the power of mediums. There are
two sentences, what were they, so we have something concrete for those of us who have not read the book. Give a two-sentence example of what he did.
Basically did a scientific assessment of mediums and their ability to work, especially with
and showed what? Established what?
Well, established that they could communicate and know things that only could be known by the departed relative.
Okay, so your opponents are saying that there are scientific experiments that prove paranormal activity is valid, happens, it's real. Stephen Avella.
Demonstrably not true. I mean, everything you said is the exact opposite of the truth. I mean, Gary Schwartz's methodology was massively flawed. It's been absolutely picked apart by other scientists. He essentially allowed himself to be bamboozled by charlatans. He did not produce anything reliable, anything that I would consider to be credible scientific evidence.
We have energy while we're alive. Where does our energy go when we die?
It doesn't go away. It's just in your atoms. They're just not continuing to live. It's exactly the same place the flame goes when you put out the candle.
Does the other side want to? Does the other side want to take on the candle argument, or?
I would say it's more a question of the information, you know, than the energy. It's not a conservation issue around energy. People often use that one to argue against soul being able to influence the material world. I would say it's much more a question of the information. And especially when you, as I said, for example, a very renowned skeptic and scientist, Carl Sagan, admitted that past life memories in children, the evidence for that is overwhelming.
Oh, that's not true.
And
come on, Carl Sagan, please.
He said that in his book. In his book, The Demon Haunted World, on page 302, he says exactly that.
Period. I've read that book 100 times. Carl Sagan did not believe in past lives. He did not believe in anything paranormal or supernatural. That is just not true.
We will have closing statements by each debater in turn. They will be 2 minutes each. Eben Alexander, an academic neurosurgeon and author of the best-selling book, Proof of Heaven.
Well, I would like to go back to what Sean had said about how consciousness is very confusing to us, as is quantum mechanics. And I would put out there, I think they're related. There's a reason why they're both so confusing, and that's, you can chuckle, but in fact that's what drove brilliant people like Einstein and others into mysticism. And in fact, I would say that that mystery has only gotten much deeper over time. We have not answered that at all. In support of my claim earlier about brain damage allowing enhanced function, which really goes against the materialist model that Stephen talked about earlier, I point out two very common examples in clinical practice: acquired savant syndromes, in which stroke, brain trauma, autism can allow superhuman mental function, something that's often seen that certainly has no explanation from the brain makes mind model, and also terminal lucidity, in which demented elderly patients often have periods of great clarity, especially around the time that they are encountering souls of departed loved ones that are there to escort them over. And I would say that these very commonly observed phenomena really demand a much deeper model of consciousness than we get out of the materialist models. Point out that Dr. Wilder Penfield wrote a book in 1975, The Conscious Mind. He probably still holds the record for having stimulated the brain in awake patients more than any other neurosurgeon, and never once did he duplicate any kind of situation of free will. He concluded very strongly that the mind consciousness is not created in the physical brain. And I think it's important to point out that the pure materialism fails at the hard problem of consciousness and at the enigma of quantum mechanics, that the brain actually confines and limits consciousness, that science acknowledging consciousness, soul, and the spirit becomes much stronger than the overly simplistic science of reductive materialism. Death of the physical brain and body is not final. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund Alexander. Stephen Nowella, he's a neurologist at Yale School of Medicine and founder of Science-Based Medicine.
So up until a couple hundred years ago, every culture in the world believed that there was a life energy. They knew intuitively, they sensed that there was something fundamentally different about living things from non-living things, and they hypothesized that there must be some energy that fundamentally makes living things different than non-living things. But over the next 100, 150 years, basically the 19th into the 20th century, we discovered biochemistry and genetics and developmental biology and all different principles of biology until essentially there was nothing left for the life force to do. We had explained everything that living organisms had do, and we explored the blurry line between living and non-living, and we realized that there's no fundamental difference there. It's just as you get increased complexity, at some point you cross this fuzzy line and you're doing a process that we call life. Well, we're kind of going through the same process, or maybe a little bit delayed, with consciousness. We understand that the brain causes consciousness. We certainly don't understand a lot about how it is produced exactly, but we're making progress. Our research paradigms are working quite well, thank you, and we're making lots of progress. It's just as irrational, if you will, to hypothesize that there is some magical energy or some non-corporeal thing, stuff, that is consciousness, as it was 200 years ago to say that, well, because we can't explain life, then we need a life force. We don't need a brain force, a mind force, any more than we needed a life force 200 years ago. The fact is that the neuroscientific community is progressing relentlessly with the paradigm that is materialist, reductionist. We're looking for neuroanatomical correlates of everything that the mind does, and that research program is very, very successful, and is how well an idea advances in science is more telling about how valuable it is, how true it is, than what our current state of knowledge is. Our current state of knowledge is always going to be incomplete. It doesn't mean that our ideas are wrong or are weak.
Thank you, Stephen Nowella. Raymond Moody, he's a medical doctor and author of the book Life After Life, in which he coined the term near-death experience. Raymond Moody.
First of all, I want to say that to me, to this day, the notion of life after death is very counterintuitive. I think as a non-religious person, I had no background in that. I've been through a process now of 40-plus years that finally drove me into this situation where I'm sort of forced to say, almost against my will, that death is not final. There is a life after death. Basically, what happened to me was that hearing thousands of people with near-death experiences, hundreds of people with shared death experiences who had the identical experience we call a near-death experience, except they weren't ill or injured. They were simply there at the bedside of someone else who died. And I have seen joint transcendent experiences where, for example, a physician and a critically ill patient would have some sort of joint transcendent experience at the same time. That leads me to be forced almost into a position to say that I trust these people's judgment. It seems to me that they've been somewhere where I haven't been, and I can begin to put a little picture together of what they're talking about. So for that reason, I would say I'm on board. I think there is life after death.
Thank you, Raymond Moody. Sean Carroll, he's a theoretical physicist at the California Institute of Technology and author of The Particle at the End of the Universe.
When I was about 6 years old, I had an emotional formative experience that apparently many other people share similar things. I was in bed, going to sleep, sort of thinking about the day and so forth, and I started crying. I was just bawling uncontrollably, so much so that my mom heard me from her bedroom and came running in and said, "What is wrong?" And I said, "Someday our grandmom is going to die. And someday you're going to die, and someday I'm going to die. We're all going to die." And, she had to explain, well, yes, and so forth, and she had her own version of the story. And the reason I'm telling the story is because even as convinced as I am that death is final, I have absolutely no desire to belittle the people in the room who disagree, who feel the other way. This is an incredibly important central issue to our lives. I personally am convinced by the overwhelming scientific evidence from physics, from neuroscience, etc., that there is one world, the natural world. Biology is a process that can end, and death is and then final. And to me, that fact, the finitude of our lives, gives enormous poignancy and importance to the finite number of years that we have here on Earth. Our lives here are not dress rehearsals. This is the act. This is the one performance that we get. That does not remove meaning or value from the lives we're leading now. It forces us to give meaning to everything we do, because we only have a finite number of things to do. If evidence came in on the other side, I would change my mind quickly, as the evidence was good enough. But I think that we're past the point where it's a scientifically interesting question. I think that we know enough to conclude that death is final, and personally I think that that is okay. Thank you.